Hello and welcome to the second episode of Mjolnir Hammers. This week we're hammering the welfare state. And we're going to look at the welfare state in all its forms, both sides of the Atlantic. Now, I turn to Hanna first, because I've got both Hanna and James with me this week. Hello to you.
Hi.
And I turn to Hanna first, because you've been debating people on the subject of healthcare. And it's
yes.
a very, very contentious issue in America is nationalized healthcare.
Yeah. Oh, look, my little nephew wants to say hi too. Yeah, a lot of Americans think that having any kind of healthcare is communism. And apparently none of us are entitled to healthcare. And if you don't know, the insurance companies charge so much for the most basic things. And they'll cover some of it, but they'll make you do what's called a copay, so you have to pay part of it. And a lot of people may not realize this, but having a baby is so beyond expensive here.
Yeah, there is a certain amount of welfare, but it tends to, or it seems to me at least, that it tends to go towards ethnic minorities. But if you're poor and white, you get jack shit.
Yes and no. If you are white, you can get some welfare, but you have to prove that, you're very, very poor. I do think it's easier for the so-called minorities to get welfare than it is for us. So
yeah, they tend to have special interest groups looking after them, don't they? Sort of lobby groups and things like that, which gives them more access to welfare.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I have a story. So when we first came here, my mom actually wanted to apply for some welfare because she was not working at the time. And so she figured it would be, a good way for us to get some extra income. And so we went to the place and I still remember it because my mom talks about it. And it was so enraging. The black woman working there told my mom that if she wanted, welfare, that she should sell her car because her car was too nice.
Right. And that's interesting, isn't it? How many black people work for the state, actually. And that in itself is pretty much almost a kind of welfareism.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, that's the reparations they asked for. They got it in the form of creating an artificial middle class among blacks by hiring far more than the population or would really deserve by meritocracy.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, and they are allowed to breed like rabbits because they have more welfare for each child that they have, which is actually really disgusting.
Yeah, we should be talking about black privilege here, really, shouldn't we? Because the state is actually privileging one race above another.
Yeah, basically, yeah. So it's not just blacks that do it. I've seen Hispanics do it as well. I also know one family because my mom works as a teacher, and she was telling me there was this one family, and I don't remember what country they were from, but they were very, very, very dark-skinned. They were obviously not white, and even though almost every single member of this family suffered from severe obesity, like, I'm not even exaggerating, they were literally obese. They were able to get so much welfare from the state. It was insane.
Yeah, we're talking Jerry Springer show obese.
Yes.
Hanging off the sides of the seats.
Yeah. The mother is so obese that a regular chair will not fit her.
She needs 2 Walmart carts to get about.
Yeah. And what really just blows my mind is that they got like $800 in food stamps for their massive, massive family. But that was not enough for them, apparently. So they went to every single religious institution in town and to beg for food. And it was given to them.
Yeah, well, this again comes down to, we have a great dislike of Christianity on this show.
Yeah.
And it just shows you, how Christians are.
But this is what's insane. They didn't they didn't confine themselves to Christianity. I mean, every single religious institution you can imagine.
There are others around there?
Apparently, although, so my mom knows this family because the kids go to her school district. Apparently, the Muslims refuse them.
Right.
So,
they generally do, Muslims, to be quite honest. They're not very big on benefits, and except when they're sponging off other religions and other secular peoples and so on.
Yeah, so they were also refused by the Jews, so.
No surprise there.
But the Christians...
If you get a shekel out of a Jew, it's like another shower.
Yeah. I can't say I'm surprised, but I do find it hilarious that they tried to beg from Jews.
Yeah. In fact, speaking about Jews and welfarism, I mean, two of the biggest anti-welfarists were Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand, both Jewish, of course. Now, the big sort of hypocrisy of Ayn Rand was that she actually took free healthcare from the state towards the end of her life when she'd got cancer, which she herself caused by her chain smoking. So this is how hypocritical these people are. You often get that hypocrisy, especially obviously with Jews all the time, but with any kind of neocon. One of the biggest hypocrisies is, if you can't have welfare, why do you pay taxes?
And
Exactly.
why bail out big corporations and banks? Because that's just welfare for the wealthy.
Yeah, it is, and that's all it is when you look at it. You see, I was watching Roger Scruton again.
A glutton for punishment.
A glutton for punishment. Absolutely right. I've got a quotation here that he talks about on human rights, but it's human rights related to welfare. And I'm just going to read this. Originally, in people like Locke and also in Kant, human rights are fundamentally negative things. A right not to be interfered with, not to have your life taken away, not to have your freedom taken away, not to have your property taken away, and so on. Essentially liberal ideas. And it's sort of an axiom of that way of thinking that your right is my duty. So if you have a right, I have a duty towards you to respect it. If your right is simply not to be interfered with, it's easy for me to fulfill that duty. I don't kill you, I don't take your property, I don't enslave you, and so on. But with the Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War, all kinds of new rights came into existence. Or they didn't come into existence. They were postulated by a process that was then initiated, including the right to have a job, the right to have security of home life, the right to have sufficient to cover the basic needs of existence, the right to healthcare, and so on. Gradually, this list of rights expanded. These are not freedoms, but claims. They're very different. It's not a freedom to go about your business undisturbed, but a claim that people are given against each other. At the time, it was part of the whole move towards a more socialist conception of the state, because once you make these claims, if you hold on to the axiom that my right is someone else's duty, you automatically have to answer the question whose duty it is to provide. And of course, it's not the duty of any particular person. It becomes the duty of society, which is another name for the state. And so it led to a massive expansion of the state's embeddedness in human relations. Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is part of disputes in politics to this day. And it's one of the things which separated liberals from socialists. Now, you'll notice, of course, there that he excludes all other modes of thought. It's always between liberalism and socialism, with liberalism becoming the fake right, which is really the old left, and socialism, of course, is the extreme left. So you've got two left.
So he's being...
Which don't make it right.
He's being intellectually dishonest.
Yeah, he is. And he always is. What's intellectually dishonest there as well is, why do you have privileges? Because if everyone's out for themselves, why do you have people with privilege and people without? You see, in a way, I can see the left's point in some respects, that you've got people with privilege and people who are underprivileged. But if you've got this idea that everyone's out for themselves, why do you give one set of people privilege and one set of people they don't get privilege? Because, of course, Roger Scruton is very much things like pro-monarchy, in a constitutional monarchy. But why do you have hereditary peerages? Why do you have a hereditary monarch? and those kind of things is already played into the socialist hands there.
Yeah.
And why do you have taxation? If you don't get anything for it, what are you paying for? That's the big problem with the question of welfare is, why do you pay taxes if you're not getting anything in return?
Exactly.
Now, in Britain, of course, with health care and so on, we've had the National Health Service since, I think it was 1948, wasn't it? Was it 46 or 48, James?
Oh, you got me there. Just after the war, certainly. I think it was 48.
Yeah. Now, I personally am for a nationalised healthcare service. I think it's a good thing.
Me too.
Well, make it topical again, this coronavirus situation, which can come to nothing, of course, but the point is that the idea of a medical emergency across a mass of people is perfectly reasonable. Imagine if this was smallpox was still around. If you had an outbreak of smallpox, would you want people to get treated fast and early and isolated? Would you want vaccinations out as much as possible?
Yes.
Then, yeah, exactly. I don't want a guy next door to me with smallpox, and then you could have your kids out playing out in the garden, and he's frightened to go to the hospital, or he's got no money to go to the hospital to get treated and isolated, or no money for a vaccine against smallpox. No, I'm absolutely fine with the idea of preventing plagues, mass deaths from diseases, or me having to be paranoid out when I'm out in the street because anybody around the corner could have, for instance, smallpox or something else horrible.
Yeah, and of course we're importing diseases at the moment. I mean, coronavirus, of course, comes from the Far East.
Yeah.
As did SARS before it.
And we had MERS before that was causing a panic. That was the Middle Eastern one.
We did have actually a case of Ebola, didn't we, in the UK?
That's right.
Did actually manage to get there, but it was isolated very quickly.
But you imagine if you turned around and said, oh, well, that'll be 40 grand for the hospital treatment and isolation and so on. You'll have to mortgage your house, and either didn't have the money or didn't want to bankrupt their families. So thought, I'll just have to tough it out. You could easily end up with a nightmare from that.
Yeah.
Like it is here in the US.
Well, I saw a press conference where somebody in the press room was asking, will the tests for the coronavirus be paid for? You know, who will pay for them? Because this is an obvious question. People aren't going to come forward to get tested for a virus if it costs a fortune to do it. They'll just say, oh, fuck, hopefully it's just a cold, or I've got nothing.
Yeah,
exactly. And so you've got a disease which could have an asymptomatic period where you can still spread it. You could end up with a huge swathe of your population. I say a huge swathe, but even like 1% still 3 million people in America. So you can have 3 million people who maybe don't have the money or are frightened to spend the money, then just waste it, because if you get the test and you come up clear, then you'll be thinking, well, that was a waste. Absolute nightmare, potentially.
Yeah. Equally, I think that we've got a pretty decent healthcare system in Britain if we went back to how it was originally designed to be. The problem is health tourism, immigrants coming in with their diseases and so on, because it's no longer a national health service, it's an international health service.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, this is kind of a different topic, but I think it kind of goes into healthcare. Do you know the reason that the population in Africa is exploding is because white people, Americans, Europeans, Australians too, I'm sure, go in there and they try to heal all their diseases, and they make childbirth so much safer for them. It has allowed their population to explode.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Western medicine has absolutely ruined the third world, to be quite honest, because nature took care of the excess population.
Yeah, all this Darwinian conditions are gone.
Arthur Kemp, I believe he made the same exact point too, that nature took care of excess Africans, but now white do-gooders have kind of put a stop to that.
I remember Prince Philip giving a speech about the population explosion in Ceylon, and that the population had tripled, and he said that means 3 times the mouths to feed, 3 times the jobs to find, and he said also 3 times the housing and everything. Yeah. And he said this is a catastrophic effect on the natural environment.
Yeah.
Yes.
He said you cannot be for humanism and environmentalism at the same time.
No, you cannot. And I believe there was, I don't know if he was a philosopher or a mathematician or something, but he said that food and other resources grow in the linear form, but if the human population grows in exponentially, then there's not going to be enough food and resources for everybody.
Oh, this is Thomas Malthus. This is where the term Malthusian disaster comes from.
Yeah, and he was right.
He was actually an economist, and he was projecting basically compound interest with regard to human beings. This was over 200 years ago. Now, basically, because of industrial methods of agriculture, we sort of managed to cheat the system for a while. But it's going to come to where you can no longer cheat the system because you just don't have enough land.
Here's what I don't understand. Why doesn't somebody go in there and do something to stop the population growth in Africa?
You'd be torn apart politically. That's the trouble. Anything that stops infinite population growth there is somehow completely forbidden. The only thing you can ever advocate for is to feed it with more water, more money, more medicine, more food. That's the only thing you're allowed to advocate for.
I remember
crazy.
There was a polemic with the comedian Spike Milligan, who was a leftist. Actually joined the British Communist Party at one point. He had also one or two right-wing ideas, but anyway. And he used to donate to all these causes, these bleeding hearts causes and everything. And he said, well, what we need to do is to put a condom in every loaf of bread that's sent to Africa. And he was pilloried for that. He was pilloried for it, and they stopped giving money to them.
But he's right, though. I mean, this is the trouble, that they can't feed themselves now. They couldn't feed themselves 50 years ago. So how can the population keep going up and still feed themselves? It's obviously at some point going to hit breaking point, because Asians can't keep sending excess food because their populations are going up. So they're going to want that food for themselves. And Europeans shouldn't be asked to starve themselves to death or just have their population dwindle to subsidise Africa. It's absolutely insane.
Our populations are already below replacement level. Why should we sacrifice ourselves for Africans?
And plus, when you actually look into a lot of these things, like, you always hear about, water charities there. And, it's not until somebody points out, they've had these water charities for about 100 years. And how the fuck can you be short of water for all this time? Constantly short of water, constant famines and so on. And you think, well, either you stop living there, as in breeding and so on, well beyond the population limit. That's probably most of the trouble. They're beyond the carrying capacity for the land. The land can support maybe 100,000, and there's probably like 10 million there. But half the time you find out things like the water shortage is because they build a well, and then, that's our problem solved, they build a well, the do-gooders go home, and then one part of a tribe or one kind of clan or family group says, it's our well now, and they tell all the weaker ones to fuck off and die. And then the weaker ones don't have water, so they say, we need a charity, and they build them a well, and by that time there's another strong out group who tell that lot to fuck off, and it just goes on in an endless cycle there. Because otherwise, what's going on would be impossible. You couldn't have hundreds of years of digging wells and somehow they're all short of water if they were running things sensibly. But they're not. They run things as tribal and quite vicious, and as a result, a bunch of them normally would just die off. But for some reason, Europeans see it as their duty to take on the burdens that are the leftovers from African tribal conflicts and societies. As if it's our fault.
White man's burden.
Yeah, essentially.
I view that as like betraying your own people. If you go to help a bunch of Africans and grow their population, and you're leaving your own people to starve, or not starve, we're not starving, but we have our own issues, then you're not a good person, you're not a noble person, and we shouldn't respect that kind of a person.
Our goal should be to make Europeans excellent and reach upwards. It's not to have everything operating in the world, non-Europeans and every other group operating at some low, bare survival minimum and pull everything else up in the world up to that. No.
Why not leave them alone and let them solve their own issues?
This is the paradox of the left. Now, the left claim to see them as equal to us. But yet, if they're equal to us, why do we have to look after them all the time?
Yeah.
You see, for me, I'm a nationalist. I'm very open about this. And I think that whatever problems they have to be solved by themselves.
And in their own way. The way they solve their problems won't be the way that we choose to solve them, or the kind of societies built to solve the problems that we would build. They have a different way of thinking, a different way of living that suits them. And the problem is the leftists, ironically, have a cultural supremacist mindset where their way is the only way, so all Africans just need to go to Starbucks and then they'll be just like them.
Absolutely, because every liberal thinks that inside every person on Earth is a liberal just waiting to get out, who thinks exactly like they do. And it comes as a great shock when they're not like that at all, when they think entirely differently. And that they don't think in the way that the liberal has romanticized them to think.
And not only that, they've no interest in becoming a liberal. When they're shown the liberal way, they don't say, oh, it's wonderful, if only someone had shown them earlier. They're often disgusted by it instead of being impressed.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the greatest problems that we've had at the moment is with Islam. All these leftists, of course, have supported Islam, largely because they see them as a battering ram against all Western values, which they claim to despise. But they have absolutely no comprehension of what Islam is.
No. It's funny you bring that up, Dave, because I saw that in my own life. There was this girl who, a typical university liberal, and she started a blog where she was advocating for a Muslim terrorist. And then she was also proudly posting up pictures of herself at the Women's March with one of those stupid pink hats and saying that, she's sure if he were freed from prison, he would march right alongside her.
Yeah, when in fact he would be quite happy to kill her given the chance.
Yeah.
Probably stone her to death, as is the custom in Saudi Arabia still.
Yeah.
I mean, even things like slavery in the Islamic world existed until the 1970s, early 80s.
Yeah. And it does really still underground.
Absolutely. They don't think that that's bad at all, particularly the slavery of black Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, who they still regard as an inferior race.
The treatment that they would have of them is very telling too. Make anything that they could blame the white man for pale by comparison.
Yeah.
I mean, their process was just to castrate all the men. 90% of them would die, and then they would take whatever survived. It's a scale that is unimaginable and that is strangely completely absent from the media. You'll hear about North America all the time. You never really hear about South America, and you'll never hear about the Arab states at all.
That's right.
No, and I find it hilarious. They complain constantly about the slavery that existed in the southern states, but that was nothing compared to what other parts of the world did.
Yeah. Because to come back to welfarism, of course, a lot of this welfarism towards ethnic minorities is to do with white guilt.
Yes.
And misplaced white guilt, to be quite honest, because, I mean, even looking at it objectively, if we look at the standards of living and so on, and the death rates and everything, things have actually been improved for them, even though I think that they shouldn't have been improved, because they had a way of life that was shorter but suited them.
Yeah, and Arthur Kemp made that point too.
And if you look at pre-60s America, when allegedly it was all, I've heard some argue it was still slavery, and even before the 60s. But even then, if you go back to, say, the 20s, the blacks had longer lifespans, better educations, better prospects than the blacks living in Africa. I mean, if you said to them, well, you can live there, where people even today still literally live in mud huts, they're not going to take the choice to give up Walmart and modern conveniences. And ironically, a lot of the blacks in the wartime kind of period and before actually had more modern conveniences than a lot of people in Britain did. The British people. And most white people in the world too, because they had access to electricity before most people in Europe did. Access to things like cars, which were an extreme luxury in Europe. Refrigerators, which were likewise. But meanwhile, people in Britain were still living with pantries and tram cars.
Yeah, but you see, I have more respect for someone like Malcolm X than I do for Martin Luther King. Because Malcolm X and his sort of successor in, what's he called now? This guy from the Nation of Islam. He's about 80 now.
Oh, I know.
It's not Elijah Muhammad, is it? It's
No.
Or is it? Is it Elijah Muhammad? I can't remember.
I thought he died.
But anyway, you know who I mean.
Yeah.
But they're sort of more my guys, because they don't want to sort of stay in our societies and leech off us or anything like that. Whereas Martin Luther King wanted to be included in our societies. Well, why would you if you're a self-respecting black man? You would want your own society, and you'd want to create it how you see fit.
Exactly.
And so those kind of the Thomas Sowells and people like that who are conservatives and so on. Oh yes, that's him, Louis Farrakhan. Yes.
Yeah.
But the likes of Thomas Sowell, who often get quoted even by people on the sort of alt-right and everything, these are not my guy. They're not hashtag our guy. These people are wanting to be included, and they're wanting the trappings that the white man has created. But as I say, that shows a lack of self-respect, because I'm a self-respecting white guy. I want a society of white people, and for us to fashion a society how we see fit.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I expect no less of any self-respecting black man either.
Or any racial, ethnic group, really.
That's right, yeah. Welfarism has to be racial, and it has to be within a nationalist context, meaning, of course, nationalist in the racial sense, because it would be within the context of an ethno-state.
Yes.
People also resent it less because you naturally tend towards looking after your own.
Now, there are forms of welfarism that I'm completely against, of course. I mean, healthcare, I think, is natural. I think that everyone has the right to healthcare. You see, this is something about Scruton. He doesn't. He sees that as an imposition. And this is the difference between me and a conservative like Scruton, that basically he's this kind of no one should be responsible for anyone else. We can't have a society like that.
Imagine if your old granny or great granny, you just chucked her out into the street because she couldn't look after herself.
That's right. And this is the nonsense, that these people kind of speak. But that said, there are kind of benefits and so on, because the problem is that in a way Scruton is right at times, in that the welfare state has expanded, and people are claiming more and more. And for all kind of things like lifestyle choices and so on. Like, for example, the beleaguered NHS now has to give surgery to so-called trans people.
What?
Yeah, that is a lifestyle choice, an abnormal lifestyle choice. These people should be treated for depression, actually, and for mental illness. They shouldn't be given surgeries. But anyway, yeah, because if you despise your own body, that shows mental illness, just like someone who self-harms.
Yeah, it's like I view them more as like people with eating disorders. Although with eating disorders, it's usually women. But in any case, let's say a young girl is anorexic or bulimic. You don't tell this girl, oh, if you see yourself as fat, then you really are fat. So, go ahead and starve yourself, or go ahead and make yourself throw up.
So there are parts of sort of welfarism that I'm completely against. Another one which we mentioned earlier was the welfarism of single motherhood. In Britain, it was brought in by Margaret Thatcher, where my single mothers got more Gibbs under Thatcher than any of the Labour governments beforehand.
Encouraging a lot of divorce, no doubt.
If you look at the changes in education from O-level to GCSE, that happened under Thatcher as well. And people forget that, which was an entirely leftist reform and had been thought up by the Labour Party before Thatcher, but she implemented it nonetheless.
I don't think people realize how despicable people like Thatcher and Reagan really were. You never look into it.
This is the thing about liberals and socialists. What they do is they actually create a dichotomy between themselves and exclude all other ideas. And so they're quite happy to debate with each other. They're not happy to debate with the likes of us. And that shows who the real enemy are to them. They're both branches of the left, really.
Well, that's what you can always tell when one of their true opposition exists, is that the tactic they always take is isolation and ignoring them. It's never to debate them.
That's right. And the liberals particularly always go on about the goodness of debate and everything, but they'll be the first to exclude the likes of us.
Absolutely. Yeah, even in America, somebody who identifies as conservatives, they would refer to people like us as quote-unquote Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. That's all they do. They refer to us as Nazis, and we're out of the door, even though our ideas predate both Nazism and liberalism. Looking at sort of the welfare of healthcare, that was once actually looked after by, well, the religious part of the society. So obviously the church, the Catholic Church particularly, in bygone times, and before that in pagan times, was looked after by people who were then demonized as witches by the Christians when, of course, the Christians came in. But these were sort of healer types. So it's always been there within a society, and it's always been kind of universal because you help the members of your own group. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah,
absolutely.
If you want your own group to prosper, which you should do, because, of course, you have to have a group that prospers because you've got to breed with someone at the end of the day. So you have to look outside of your family because it's not good if you sort of breed with your family over generations. You'll end up with dysgenics. So you need a sort of a wider circle, if you like, which is the race, ultimately.
Yes, and you can't have a society of sociopaths. Like, when I look at Ayn Rand, that's what she wanted, a society of sociopaths, but that would never work.
Well, this is the problem with atomized individualism from the likes of Friedman and Rand and so on, or of course they're Jewish, but you've got Gentile ones as well.
Yes.
And you can tell a lot of it gets bonkers because, one, their personal lives are usually a mess, because Ayn Rand's personal life was an absolute mess when you look into it. Her love life, her personal life, it was a complete disaster. And also, the other side of it is when you listen to these sort of, often you'd call them libertarian types now, is their ideas are so ridiculous that it takes them paragraphs and paragraphs to try and work around things that should only take a sentence at most, or things that should be so simple they're just instinctive, and were instinctive and worked fine for thousands of years, but these people knock themselves up in a ball trying to explain the most basic things in life because they've removed nature from their life, so they can't use that. So now they have to fabricate these astonishing word games and philosophical tongue twisters to try and explain everything. Yeah. Immediately you realise that, one, it's a disaster because it's worse than listening to people interpret the Bible back and forth to each other. And it's the same sort of game because they'll all start quoting this and trying to play word game that. And second of all, it's completely incompatible with society because half your society, if you've got an average IQ, is obviously going to be below 100. They're not going to understand any of this remotely. It's completely incomprehensible, all these libertarian ideas. They take 3 pages to explain basic parts of life. That's why it's useless. If it can't work for the majority of people and they can accept it and understand it, it's a useless worldview. You can inform the elites with it, who can try and form a society and step down and explain it all, but the libertarians don't have that because every man's an island and it's all up to themselves to work out this contract between this person and so on. It'll never work.
Well, this is because of their target, basically, and who they're aiming at are people like themselves. In other words, people of the upper middle class, or as we often say, the bourgeoisie.
And just remember to donate to their channel for X amount per month. Donate to their channel so they can have the world turn libertarian, which it never will. You're never going to have Africa become libertarian.
Yeah,
no.
Which when you think is a form of welfare. Because they're getting money for nothing, really. I mean, what are they providing? Some kind of service? They're not. And then you see what, the sham and the scam and the con merchantry and all the kind of dishonesty that goes with it. And what they're doing is they're just getting money by any means they see fit. When you look at Roger Scruton, he's always going on about respecting people's property. They always talk about property. Well, socialists talk about property all the time because they talk about having a communal property and that everything's owned by the state. But equally, these people will also talk about my property. Everything is reduced to property. But there are things that are greater than property as well. It's nice to have things and so on, but you can't be a total materialist. There are certain abstract values that are important. Things like honor, things like your good name. People used to talk about having a good name.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things like heroism. These are abstract concepts that materialists like the liberals, they can't deal with. Things like the ancient Greek heroes and so on will live on forever. Why? Because they're written down in things like the Iliad and so on.
The Odyssey.
That's right, yeah.
And a society with those people will be far more successful than one without.
Yeah.
If you have a
exactly.
society, all these people just willing to sell each other out, it's never going to work.
That's right. And this is why liberalism is as much nonsense as socialism.
We even get groups now that call themselves propertarianists. So, I mean, they're not even hiding it. They call themselves that.
Oh, yes. Wasn't that Kurt Doolittle's little scam?
There's a kind of circle around him of various ones that promote this in this kind of strange religious fervour around him.
Yeah, branch of the alt-right again.
Yeah, kind of chums up with various heads, even though ideologically they should be incompatible, so it doesn't make any sense why they should be chumming together.
Yeah, but I do believe in the reciprocal nature of the welfare system. In other words, that you have to do something to actually get welfare. So in other words, unemployment benefit's a good thing if you work, but not for people who are eternally on the dole.
No.
And basically, you know that they're lazy, feckless people who will never get a job in their lives. Basically, you just cut all benefits and force them to get a job, or they die. That's it. And if they die, you've got rid of a sort of section of society that has no function and no use, because you don't want an underclass really at all.
Because realistically, these people would immediately come around. They're not going to starve to death. They would do something to earn money.
Exactly. But equally, when Crouton talks about that the state has no duty to provide jobs for people and so on, well, it does in a way, because I mean the state's what we're dealing with at the moment. Ideally, what you want is, as we've talked about before, aristocratic paternalism, which used to work because they looked after the land, so on and so forth, and people worked on the land, and it provided structure. But if you haven't got that aristocratic paternalism, you need something to replace it, and at the moment it's the state, obviously. You've got the state at the moment, and that's what we're working with until we get to a stage where we've got an aristocratic idea of society again. But even then, you could call it the state. The only difference between the state and an aristocratic view of society is that you would have individuals that you can point at. Because the thing about the state is what you've got is faceless bureaucracy, whereby you've no idea who is in charge of anything. Yeah. Whereas when you've got an aristocratic society, you know who you're dealing with. You know who to go to. You know the man, and often, of course, if he's a proper aristocrat, he will come down and see how things are going on and everything. And he will communicate with the masses because it's his job. Because in a society, everyone should have a function. And just as there are privileges, there are responsibilities also. Yeah. You see, this is the problem with the likes of Scruton and other liberals, is they're happy about privilege, but they don't want responsibilities.
Yeah, when you've got somebody that's named in charge, there's somebody to blame for when things go wrong. Currently, you just say, oh, it's the system, and they shrug. Oh, well, it's the department, and they shrug. It's the bureaucracy, and they shrug. Nobody's to blame. It's just how things go, and they muddle on. So nothing gets sorted. When in real life, that isn't how it works. Every system is made up of people, no matter what. People decide the rules, people implement the rules, people run the system, people dole out whatever the system's meant to do. That's how it works. So people are to blame, no matter what. There's always somebody you could point at in reality. But the whole way it's now set up, and the way some people seem to continue to advocate for or want to make worse, is where you're removing the people from it, and you've just got these mechanisms as if it's just cogs in a big machine. Oh, I just need to redesign the machine so it runs itself.
Yeah, well, this is, of course, why you've got automation increasingly in answer phones and so on. When you go on to some kind of governmental phone line or anything, it will give you a list of options. Press 1 for this, press 2 for this, and so on and so forth. And then it goes on to another recording of a person. But you never actually get to listen to a person, let alone see one, because actually seeing someone face to face, that has gone. And this is the great problem with society, of course, in that you cannot see someone face to face. And even someone like William Faulkner was talking about it many, many years ago already. We've got that famous scene in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath as well, where he's having his farm repossessed, this guy. And the guy comes to repossess and he says, I'm just a lackey. It's the bank that sends me. He says, well, should I shoot the bank? Well, they only report to the shareholders and so on. And the guy says, well, who do I shoot? It's that kind of system. And of course, there isn't anyone. It's all sort of indirect.
Well, we saw that with the Soviet Union extreme as well. That was a sort of early glimpse of where you can end up. Because there, it just rocketed off at great speed at one point with nothing to hold it back. So you had people shooting the kulaks for hiding a bag of grain, and nobody was to blame again. It's just the system. It's not this guy. It's not that guy, and so on. Everybody washes their hands of it, and you just sort of blame this political blob, or not even the political, it's something else. Just the mechanism.
Yeah.
And in the end, I would happily point at the guy that shot the farmer and say he's an evil bastard. Because if you're robbing people and shooting them, yeah, that sounds like an evil deed to me. You can come up with your excuses, but even if you say, I was threatened, well, you're still passing on the evil. I mean, it's like people that are addicted to drugs selling drugs to more people. If you're addicted and you know how miserable it is, then why are you passing on the misery?
Exactly, because ultimately, if you're addicted, you have to get money to feed your addiction. And the way to get money to feed your addiction is to become a dealer yourself.
And it doesn't really matter what the system of misery is, whether it's your libertarian fantasy, whether it's communism or drugs. If all you're doing is passing on misery, it's not really worth doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got to come back to the point where we need to return to a system where it's individuals that are responsible, individuals that are doing good, bad, are praised and held up, because that's the other side of it. You would build a statue to some great man or great woman, and likewise, if somebody's a villain or incompetent, you would point at them and say, that's the person to blame, and they would get thrown out.
Yes.
And we've lost that. We've lost this now.
Absolutely. You see, the problem with the old form of aristocracy after the Norman conquest was that these people ultimately were no longer responsible for anything. They basically could not be demoted, if you like. In a functioning aristocracy, if someone is seen to be incompetent, they should have the capacity to be removed.
Yeah, you always need some sanity check to remove ones which have gone off the rails, were just born strange, or whatever it is.
Yeah, and this is why, of course, because the aristocracy themselves became extremely liberal. And in the 1920s, they just ended up gambling and living a life of debauchery and so on.
The privilege without duty.
That's right, privilege without duty, and abandoned everything that they were meant to take care of. Largely because, of course, the aristocratic families who did take their duties seriously, all the menfolk of those families had been killed in the First World War.
And it's important to highlight that a lot of the grievances or impressions people have of aristocracy as being these uncaring people, which I see all the time, even from intellectuals, film critics, writers. I see this all the time. It's they're basically black hat, mustache twirling villains with a plummy accent. That is not how they had to be or always were.
No, that's
it's
right.
A very modern impression.
That's right. They tended to be the officer class, and that meant that they led men into battle. And of course, in the First World War, which was an industrialized form of warfare, they were killed off proportionally more than any other class. One, because they tended to be taller, and two, because they tended to be at the front, because they were the ones actually leading the men. And that was their duty to do so in these sort of older aristocratic families that were actually given their titles for militarism rather than for mercantilism. Because there's a great big difference between the forms of aristocracy of earlier and the later periods, where people started getting titles, hereditary peerages and so on for things that they did in realms of finance and things like that. But originally, of course, we tend to forget that these titles like Earl and so on, they were actually military titles.
Yeah.
They meant that you commanded a certain amount of men into battle. And of course, sadly, many of that kind of aristocrat were killed off in the First World War, leaving the debauched kind of essentially bourgeois people with titles to govern the system. This is what we've got as a result of that. But of course, I mean, I'm talking great generalizations here, great sweeping generalizations, because even earlier to that, it was a process that had started long before that in any case. But the First World War did hasten it.
Well, I know you had things like the baronets, which were all just basically bought titles.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, as you say, it was a process, but it's a case of they started seeding the aristocracy with merchants. Later on, you had the process of killing off the old breed who still had some noble spirit.
But to come back to welfarism and so on, these aristocrats were responsible for the welfare system before the state welfare system, if you like, because the state welfare system was brought in originally 1910 by David Lloyd George, who of course was Liberal Prime Minister. Now then, was it Lloyd George or was it Asquith? No, I think it was Lloyd George. Anyway.
He won't complain at this point.
Okay. But anyway, it was brought in at that point. But prior to that, there was also a kind of welfarism, such as pensions and things like that were given from the reigning monarch, and below that from aristocrats to worthy people, to people who were worth it, basically, who had proven to be good eggs, if you like.
Yeah, it's not something you really hear about now, but even in Napoleonic times, you hear about this: heroes getting a pension and great artists getting all sorts of sponsorship. Yeah. Not from some sort of soulless state committee bureaucracy that was obligated to hand out X amount per year, but it was individual families who saw something great, saw something that was exceptionally brave.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in medieval times, good soldiers were often rewarded with pubs. This is where the word landlord comes from, of course. Because at that point, when you're given a pub, not just anyone had land. Very few people had land, and if you were given a pub, you'd got land. All of a sudden, you were a landlord, not a landowner, mind you, because that comes in later. This idea of a landowner, you were a landlord. You're responsible for that, and so if you were shown to be worthy, getting a pub was kind of, you were almost a gentleman at that point, and you were on the first rung of joining the aristocracy yourself.
And it's a good system when you think about it, even from a sort of genetic, biological point of view, to take a modern spin where you're essentially given a very slow filter to see, right, how good is this bloodline and how stable is it? You're giving them a slow chance to work up the rungs and say, hey, this one has potential. Try him as a landlord, see how it goes. Oh, he's still sensible, he's still doing good. And then maybe they'll get the next step up in the next generation, and so on, which did happen. There's countless examples of families that worked their way up and went back down.
Yeah, that's right. And so this, when we look at hereditary peerages and something, there is actually a very good idea behind it. And it's the idea of seeing if the apple falls not too far from the tree and so on, and that they do good and so on, and so they will get rung up further and everything, and eventually they will get titles and greater titles and so on. Just like, for example, the very first Duke of Wellington, who was actually born without a title.
It's a good incentive.
Yeah, ended up with a dukedom, which is one of the highest titles available. Why? Because he won the Napoleonic Wars. Why wouldn't you give it him? And actually, if you look at the further Dukes of Wellington, the Duke of Wellington himself, the first one, was Arthur Wellesley, as I believe he was called. It was of landed gentry in any case, but he didn't have a title. But he obviously did something great and was rewarded for doing that. If you look at his descendants, they tended to be very right-wing, including some that had, shall we say, far-right tendencies back between the wars. And so this, for me, is a better way of looking at welfarism and so on. So I believe in universal healthcare and so on. I think that's a good thing. I think that it should be structured, but equally should have individuals looking after it at a local level. And how you do that is through aristocracy, because everyone governs a certain stretch of land and so on. And it's the same with pensions, because I think anyone who's worked very hard during life should have a pension. At the moment in France, there are lots of demonstrations and so on because the government is slowly upping the age of retirement.
That's going to be happening everywhere, I'm quite sure.
It's already happened in Britain, of course.
Yeah. I think it'll be going up again, of course. They're already talking about it going up again.
Yeah, they're talking about 70 years old now, aren't they?
Yeah, there's some promoting 75.
Yeah. When you look at that, you ask, well, where is my money that I have paid in taxes? And of course, it's going to foreign interests.
Yeah, it was spent the instant you gave it to them.
Yeah. It's going to foreign aid. It's going to asylum seekers.
Debt payments.
And so on and so forth, which, of course, if the government has got itself into debt, it's incompetent. It's proven to be incompetent. But again, there should be individual responsibility for that incompetence. People like Blair should be brought to account for his individual incompetence. And he's a multimillionaire now. Well, how can you bankrupt a country? And especially his successor, Gordon Brown. Now, he sold off the gold at the lowest point that it was worth.
Brown's bottom, they called it.
Yes, that's right. They call it the brown bottom. And how can he sit there, a millionaire, having bankrupted the country? He should have his assets, his private assets, seized for that. And he should be disgraced.
Well, interestingly, in Roman times, if you were trying to get elected and you promised that you were going to fix the drains in the city or something, then when you get elected, you had to do it out of your pocket. It was expected that, right, go on then. You said you were going to fix all the drains, get to it.
Yeah.
And so it was a very different way of looking at the world back then, in what was a relatively high civilization.
Yeah. One of the highest civilizations, of course. But equally, just as it was an extremely high civilization, it was brought down by internal corruption, just as our present societies are being brought down within the European Union, within the United States of America, and so on and so forth, throughout the European diaspora and Europe itself. But these things are not reversible. People always, especially conservatives, they talk about making the best of decline. I don't. I see that I'm more of a revolutionary in that sense. I suppose I have a certain amount of the left, but not, of course, the politics to the left. But in this idea of revolution, I think that's a good thing, because you can easily, once you've had a revolution, you can start again and you can create things anew. Utopianism is not a bad thing. And now again, Roger Scruton, he talks about that utopianism, you can never achieve perfection and so on and so forth. You can never achieve what you set out to achieve and everything. That's not really true. He talked about a gambler, used the analogy of a gambler, that the gambler always has this optimistic idea that he will win. Well, I don't look at things like a gambler. I look at things like a sportsman. And a sportsman is convinced of his victory, otherwise he wouldn't compete, would he?
Or think of a farmer or a gardener who might spend years, a lifetime or generations to build something good out of that land.
Yeah. But in both cases, the sportsman or the gardener, they believe in their own ability and they believe in themselves and they believe in their vision. And oftentimes it pays off. The greatest sportsman, of course, we look at someone like Joe Calzaghe, for example, or Rocky Marciano, the boxers who retired unbeaten. Well, that's perfection. They achieved perfection. Their records are perfect. So perfectibility is achievable. And so the ideas of Scruton are proven to be complete bollocks, to be quite honest. He's using an analogy of a gambler, but this is gambling, relying on your own ability.
Yeah,
you're not relying on something that is completely sort of random and subject to the realms of probability and so on. You're relying on your own skill, your own nous, your own wisdom, intelligence, and so on and so forth. And in the case of a sportsman, natural ability coupled with training.
There's also an aspect to perfection where you've got to have something to aim at that's beyond even what you can reach. And there's nothing wrong with that. You think about moving towards a goal, and that's perfectly fine. You don't have to say, well, that's me reached it, so, or society has reached a certain point, so we'll all just sit here and stagnate now. That's not how it has to work either.
Yeah, so, don't rest on your laurels.
Yeah, and he's intelligent enough. Roger Scruton is an intelligent man. He knows the idea of having a big goal, a vision to strive for, is worthy in itself and can do a lot of good to have people reach up towards it.
Yeah, one thing I want to finish off with as well, the difference between the likes of us, who are called the far right and everything, and this fake right of Roger Scruton, because they're liberals and they're really of the left. And this is that we're often demonized, that we don't care about other people and so on, when in fact our ideas are extremely paternalistic, as we've talked about before. And we would actually care for, for the sick and disabled and so on. Why? Because they're our people. Simple as that. You see the likes of Ayn Rand. She's obviously of an alien people in any case, and she was adamant that the disabled and so on shouldn't be looked after. Now, one of the interesting things that happened under Labour, under New Labour, the socialists, the left, the people, the caring people, as they like to portray themselves, is that, I don't know if you remember, James, but there was this company called Remploy, which is sort of an NGO. It was sort of semi-private, semi-governmental. And it was often people with learning disabilities and so on that did jobs that were basically manual, very basic, things that they could do actually, but which it gave them something within their capacities whereby they actually had meaning and felt that they were doing something good.
Yeah, I've spoken to people that were involved with that, either as disabled or kind of assistants, and nothing but positive. They actually turned out a lot of interesting, nice stuff as well.
Yeah, and it was Labour that closed the factories.
Yeah.
And people forget that 2007, I think it was, that they closed all these factories down because these people were no longer fashionable.
I just gave them nothing. They had nothing in return to replace it.
Yeah.
Except maybe getting sent to the job centre and told that that somebody with quadriplegic had to keep applying for jobs.
Yeah, exactly. And often people who had worked in the past but were suddenly incapable were victimised by the socialist state because they'd worked in the past. They never pick on someone who's never worked, of course, because they're seen as a lost cause. But the people who are suddenly incapacitated or something like that, they'll keep picking on them and keep trying to to get them back into work and so on and so forth. Where sometimes it's impossible, especially if, for example, they've served in the forces, they've been out to war or something like that. And, a landmine has blown off their legs, and arms or whatever, or they've been brain damaged or something like that. This can happen to any one of us, of course. And the Labour Party, of course, they've sent them out to these wars, often illegal wars, don't give a shit about them. And they're coming back, in pieces, and also they end up sleeping rough and things like that. And they're just cast onto the street.
Yeah.
Whereas a decent system, a rightist system, like the ones that we propose and everything, they would be looked after, these people. They would be particularly looked after because they've served their country and their people in the best and most noblest ways possible.
Taking big risks for the rest of their people?
Absolutely, yeah. Now, of course, these wars, unfortunately, they're being created to serve both foreign and corporate interests. These wars simply would not exist in a rightist society. But sometimes wars have to be fought in our own interest. But people would be rewarded for that. I mean, it is absolutely cynical what has happened to the soldiers who have fought in these illegal wars and so on.
Yeah. You see, even things like, you hear about the sort of injuries that they get just as part of the job, and they end up just going through cycles of this job and that job and trying to struggle on once they've sort of retired, because they're no longer maybe physically fit. Things like paratroopers end up with wrecked knees quite commonly.
Oh, yeah, because of the landing and everything.
Yeah, and, once they're out of that, what happens? They end up with sort of just menial working class jobs from something that was quite an elite position, really, when you think about it. I mean, not anybody can become a paratrooper.
No, that's right. And these people should be integrated into society in a way that gives them meaning still.
Yeah, and you think about it, after the Second World War, there was a whole demob effort, and there was some effort to get people into various positions. Something like that could continue at a sensible scale. You know, same as Remploy looks after disabled, you could have another system for people coming out of the army. Instead of, as it was notorious, they would get all sorts of experience and qualifications in the army that when they came out weren't recognised by any civilian employer. They're completely worthless. Yeah. So they could actually have very high level technical competence, but they wouldn't be seen fit to stack a shelf in a supermarket.
No, that's right. Whereas they could easily be retrained, because if you've got a technical competence like that, it can easily be changed into something else.
If somebody's good at radio operating, they're bound to have the brains and the craftsmanship or handy skills to do other stuff.
That's right, yeah. Whereas actually the problem is that they are not being trained for anything. They're just being
toughed out.
Left. Yeah.
And look at the notoriously, not long ago, remember there was the big purge in the army where they sacked a load of people that were coming up for their pension? That was in the news a while ago.
Yeah,
a few years ago.
Absolutely. And that again is totally cynical.
Disgusting. I would actually go beyond cynical to say it was actually disgusting. To somebody that's put in the years, that some of them were just months from their pensionable age, and then they just chucked them out.
And so then, I mean, at the moment, it's not actually worth joining the army or any of the armed forces because they're just abused like that. I don't know how things are in America, but I don't know. Trump seems to be fostering this image that he's caring towards the armed forces. I don't know how true it is, to be quite honest. Is it all talk? Does he really do anything for them? I don't know.
A lot of his stuff, though, is all talk. I mean, the 4 years have been and gone. Where's the wall, mister?
Well, exactly, yeah.
You know, I mean, all these people that talk about how great he was and how they're going to meme him into office and he'll do this, that, and the other. Well, he's had 4 years. I still see people cling to him desperately, say, oh, going to get Trump back in 2020, going to do this, that, and the other. And they'll cling to him for another 4 years, and then nothing will happen. I mean, if they prove me wrong and magically he suddenly pulls the mask off and starts his white nationalism, you can call me out on it. But I would say it's a pretty safe bet that nothing will happen of interest.
On the contrary, he did endorse the Golan Heights for Israel.
Yes.
Oh dear.
Yeah, and they named a settlement after him. And he said he's the least anti-Semitic president that's ever been, and he's most for Israel that's ever is. He doesn't understand why the left don't like him.
So you've either got the most pro-Israeli president going, or you've got Bernie Sanders who's Jewish himself.
Who's critical of Israel. So there you go. Just get a Jewish man who's a bit critical of how Israel's run, and there you go. It's a joke, isn't it? There's your choices. It reminds me of, remember the Simpsons sketch with the two aliens going, it's a two-party system, you've got to vote for one of us.
That's right. And then there's the human there saying, well, you can vote for me, and they said, a third party is a wasted vote.
That's right. It's sad when not only is it the mainstream, you see that kind of, we've got to vote for one of these two, that's the only choice. You even see people in the alt-right default to this, well, we've got to back him because if we don't back him, we'll get somebody that's even worse. Yeah,
and that's the thing, that's the negative thinking.
Yeah.
They're always looking at, what's the least of the evils?
Yeah. Does he rob us of 50% or all of it, and that's your only choice?
Yeah, instead of actually thinking, well, what can we do? What can we construct? Utopianism is not foolish. Utopianism, you've got to start it with utopianism. You've got to look at the possibilities and aim for them.
The power of a strong vision like that, it can't be denied. It's one of the few things that the Soviets and communist types do recognise, the power of a utopian vision. Now, their method and their goal is completely wrong, but you can see the impact that vision that they'll advertise has in people.
Yeah. and the revolutionary spirit. And of course, what we really need now is a revolution from the right. And that has actually happened in the past. So it's not out of the realms of possibility.
And it can't be done by people cynically grifting. It's not really the same thing. Especially when, despite what people talk about me moving Trump into office, blah, 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 it is absolutely tiny, as you've pointed out. And anybody that's going to argue with that, just look at all these online circles where you'll see the same hosts with the same guests, and the host of that show is the guest on that show. You could fit them all in a bus. You could fit all the public figures and all the white people you listen to of significance on a bus. I mean, that's globally. I'm talking about internationally. You could fit them all onto a bus because you look at these, it's the same people. They're all turning up in each other's show. They rotate through the same half dozen people as guests.
Yeah, and it's deliberately done. Is to keep the shekels within a given and limited group of people because they're not actually interested in growing the movement.
No.
And certainly they're not interested in ideas that are really rightist either.
No, there's a certain degree to which they'll push things and then no more.
Yeah.
And ironically, they won't tolerate anything to the right of it.
That's right. They like to keep things at what I would call the right end of liberalism. So really sort of classical Lockean liberalism might even get as far as Thomas Hobbes, but they probably wouldn't know the works of any of those two writers in any case.
No, which is another problem in itself. especially when certain famous ones confuse Dresden and Berlin as cities and so on.
Oh dear.
But I mean, along that tone though, that's why we encourage, may as well, anybody listening, for anybody to actually have a go at something themselves. It's the only way we'll get out this retarded cycle is for people to have a go at it. Sink or swim, it's not going to cost you a fortune to have a try. All these free online services out there.
Yeah, and if we like the cut of your jib, we'll advertise you.
Yeah, and that's how you grow something organically.
Yep, and we don't expect any money or anything like any kind of remuneration for that.
No, if we like it, we'll plug you quite happily.
Yeah, simple as that. There we go. Nice message to leave it on, I think, James.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I say thank you once again to James and Hannah, although Hanna sadly had to leave us again. But we will see you again for the next installment of Mjolnir Hammers. And what will we hammer next time, I wonder?
Something to ruffle some feathers.
Yes, as usual. Well, bye for now.